So it seems that we have two issues. Then we have the legal institution that provides the standard or the basis for defining and understanding conflict minerals and violations of human rights. But we also have the system of accounting, which is an entirely different type of institution, which is how do you then verify reports that are consistent with our understanding of the law itself? So how does one even account for that? So we've already identified two different institutions. Very good. Dr. Martin?
Yeah, I appreciate everything I'm hearing thus far, and I hope that my next comments will add to this discussion. As you think about this definition, I think that you also have to consider the thought that you have to truly appreciate interdisciplinary studies, not just multidisciplinary studies. When we're talking about multidisciplinary studies, we're talking about, say, for example, we have history and have philosophy, but there's no interaction between the two. So if we're talking about interdisciplinary studies, we're talking about those interactions between those two disciplines and what stream of consciousness evolves from that, which becomes a new paradigm for dealing with the issues. So as we talk about conflict minerals, I don't think this work can be done in a historical context. So if we're going to talk about the issues, say for example, you mentioned genocide being a Western idea and this notion of ethnic cleansing being something that local people, indigenous folks sort of pertain to, you have to understand the history of Africa from the period of the Berlin Conference and the period of colonization and imperialization that took place. And so when you look at that and realize that many of the African nations did not gain independence until the 50s and 60s, you have to understand that you're dealing with many different regions who have a civic public administrative structure that is based on the model of the British experience, the French experience, the Portuguese, the German, or other. And so, those things have to be understood within that framework, because in order to maintain that power and that hegemony, many of those folks in those nations were very much embedded into that cultural structure. And how those cultural structures, that were imposed on them, really sort of ignored, the whole issues of anthropology in terms of cultural behaviors and sensitivities, and the lack of boundaries and borders. So all these things were withdrawn, or all these artificial boundaries were included. So that's just one to kind of really think about as you do this. The other thing is that within your definition, I think, and I like the things that I heard before about not being so mild and actually using the term genocide, in some ways just murder. But I think one of the terms that I'm starting to use more and more now is this notion of structural violence. Structural violence. We're talking about institutional behaviors and attitudes and traditions and laws, treaties, etc., that have that lead to decision making that creates or perpetuates these power imbalances, but also too understanding that it's not just violence as we know it. It's not just physical violence one-on-one, but we're talking about the violence that is caused by such decision makings that lead to a number of different psychosocial stressors that lead to fear, anxiety, illness, murder, death, etc. I mean, I could go into much more detail about that, but let's just sort of sum it up. One good way of looking at this is just to look at Haiti, for example, and Farmer's book, Pathologies of Power, and understanding how structural violence has created these imbalances. And that's what you see being played out there. And just one other brief note, this notion of, I mentioned philosophy. Again, I'm not going to get into the ultimate reality, the meta realities of some of this.
You're more than welcome to. We do have a philosophy student.
Well, that's great. Well, that's good. That's good. I like to wax philosophically, so I'm not going to get into the meta issues right now. But I'm going to pick on this notion of epistemology, the study of knowledge. And you mentioned, who defines it, and that's one of the things I think we have to be very careful and be astute about. Who defines it? Because the person who defines it controls it. And that's how the other knowledge is produced around that issue. And then I think we get into axiology and values and ethics, and then logic that's necessary with this. So, many ways, I mean, these problems are philosophical problems, and we have to be mindful of that and how we incorporate bits and pieces of knowledge from many different realms, to put into this. So, I'll kind of stop. Oh, metrics. Metrics. In your definition, as you were talking about this, this notion, there's a very quantitative approach to this. But I think for the future, as you do research with this, not only do you need numbers, you have to remember that statistics are just snapshots. As Disraeli said, there are numbers and statistics. There are lies, there are damn lies, and then there are statistics. But also think about the qualitative pieces, the narratives. It's the stories. And these are the stories that usually wind up, with the numbers. They increase the power of those numbers, when you go before tribunals or you go to, the International Court of Justice, because those stories, I mean, trauma is one of those gifts that keeps on giving. It crosses generations, it's multi-generational, it's intergenerational, and those stories of the suffering that is happening there have to become alive in people's minds. It has to become much more than just, a vague scene that we've seen on TV or some news shot. Those stories are very compelling. So think about mixed methods as you do this work. Because mixed methods, and also too, as my colleague said, understanding what a human rights-based approach is to this work. Okay, I'm finished now. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine.
do not apologize.
That brings it back around for me in the sense of when we're talking about this and we're defining the difference also between conflict minerals and strategic resources. When you speak of suffering, we classify that on a variety of levels. I would personally consider uranium a conflict resource, or not necessarily a strategic resource, but a major conflict mineral in the center of international conflict between nations specifically. And though it's, when you speak of suffering, the image that I get is when we talk about genocide, we talk about rape being used as a weapon. I don't think of the economic suffering that comes in when the U.S. and the UN imposes sanctions against Iran, for example. And so that's another one of those areas where, again, when we're doing these definitions, it's been problematic for us to quantify and qualify those things.
Yeah. And that speaks to Dr. Martin's point of structural violence as well. I mean, this concept of the threat of mutually assured destruction becomes one of these forms of structural violence, whether it's implicit or explicit. The idea that uranium is part of that discussion and part of an element of that, almost the most important element in that entire process, that's a very, very important thing to understand and acknowledge.
And may I just add another point
Sure.
to that? As you mentioned uranium, you have to remember that the uranium that led to the production of the atomic weapons in the U.S. first came from the Congo, also too. So there's another historical precedent that's there.
Which brings me back to another point that I wanted to discuss today, hopefully, is that when we're defining strategic resources versus conflict minerals, there are contracts on the table. Right now, there are no open uranium mines in the Congo, but there are contracts on the table to open up a few new mines in a couple of different areas. And given the history of the laissez-faire attitude with the trans-border crossing of minerals in the region, what then happens? Does it become, when you open up a uranium mine and you have what now is a strategic resource being produced in a region where traditionally and historically it has been extremely difficult to track the disbursement and distribution of minerals across borders throughout the region, what then happens on the geopolitical level and who becomes involved?
It's an interesting question. And I'm going to answer that, I suppose, in a few moments or so. But the thing that's foremost in my mind right now is that as we talk about this notion of defining things again, we also have to go back to this notion of defining national security.
Global security.
Or global security in that sense. And what does that mean for many different nations? I mean, we're talking about issues of sovereignty here. We're talking about a lot of interesting political issues that have an impact on how decisions are made or not being made in order to accomplish this. So, it's problematic in the sense that more discourse and dialogue is obviously needed, but also at the same time, we can't be so deliberate in our discussions that we ignore the perils of the suffering that is going on. And so, I think the thing that bothers me so much about this in many ways as we try to define those terms too is that some people like to go for the low-hanging fruit on the tree and take the path of least resistance and try to solve what they think are the easy problems. But I think overall, as we talk about these global issues, we have to understand that they are very complex issues. And so it requires multiple levels of analysis. It requires multi or interdisciplinary teams. It requires people coming together with different skill sets, to come together to have those fruitful discussions in order to figure out, okay, how do we prioritize what needs to be done? And so I think there's opportunity at the table for having those discussions if there's the appropriate forum for this. And I think that you folks are on the right path as you begin this discussion, as you go forth with this, particularly within the School of Management, the Graduate School of Management. As we talk about issues of public administration, and what does social responsibility mean on that level?